This section is all about the causes of river degradation. Make sure you stick around for the questions at the end.
A lot of people come to an area and they see the river as it is and think it's going to be always like that. But they are dynamic. Over hundreds of years, thousands of years, they will move significantly through a landscape. Some floodplains in the Hunter are kilometres wide, and the rivers over time would move right across that landscape. Other areas, they're more constrained. But even here, a lot of these features you see around us are actually floodplain features. So the river is dominating not just here, but hundreds of metres either side. And so rivers do change. And one thing that a lot of river management and restoration, even up to the 1990s, people thought erosion was bad. And they would try to stop it by rock walling rivers, engineering rivers, just to keep them straight. And that just caused so many problems at site, but also downstream. So the main thing to realize is rivers are dynamic. That can be a negative. You can lose plants if you're planting on a riverbank and the river moves. You can have slumps or erosion gullies, which can destroy some of the work you've done. But they can also, that dynamic nature can also act in your favour. And I'll give an example later on how we used floods to actually restore a river down at the McDonald. Rivers are also leaky systems. So being farmers, you understand that there's inputs and outputs to agriculture. You can't just keep on taking out of the soil without putting something back in. Even cattle, over time, you'll lose nutrients from the property. So you've got to maintain nutrient cycles on agricultural lands. The same happens with rivers. So river systems, by their nature, you've got water moving stuff downstream. Nutrients are soluble. Those nutrients get moved downstream. Sediments and organic matter gets moved downstream. So that's why river estuaries are often very, very rich ecologically, and also in terms of production for seafood. And the Hunter estuary with the prawns, Fullerton Cove, all the wetlands down there, basically are all the nutrients that come from up the catchment, and also all the sediments that come from up the catchment. Now, rivers in their natural state slow down that leakiness. Basically, they're small leaks, and you kind of reach an equilibrium. And over time, nutrients especially enter the system at the same rate they leave the system. And you might have some ups and downs, but generally, pre-European, the rivers were in a form of equilibrium. Now what's happened with the clearing, that equilibrium has been disturbed, and we've lost more than is going into the system. The catchments also looked significantly different 200 years ago to what they look like today. With the clearing of riverbanks, we've got bed lowering, so the river is actually lower in the floodplain than it would have been pre-European. The banks are degraded and falling in. You've got excessive amounts of sediment in the river. You probably would never have seen these sandbars in the river 200 years ago. And the rivers flow faster, and there's more water flows down them because the water's not being retained in the landscape. Rivers are important to drive ecosystems across the broad landscape. So we talked a bit about nutrients. The river banks are often, because nutrients do tend to flow downhill and downstream, healthy riverbanks form ecological communities which are very high in nutrients generally. And that's why in areas like this you would have had rainforest growing pre-European. Now, the plants actually hold the nutrients in the system. They tend to cycle them, but also, again, pre-European, a lot of animals would have lived in the broader landscape, but come down to the river for water and also for food. And then those nutrients would have then been taken back up the hill. So especially birds would come down, feed on berries and fruits, and then go back to nesting sites up the hill, crap out the berry seeds, and so nutrients would actually move from rivers up into the landscape as well. Floods can also move sediment, organic matter, and nutrients uphill, and there's systems then to hold it in. And again, because we've changed that dynamic, because we've changed the geomorphology, that that critical function of holding nutrients and letting nutrients spread through the landscape is not functioning so well anymore. Rivers are also a critical water supply. A lot of floodplains tend to, nowadays, in particular, we've lost a lot of the floodplain wetlands that would have once existed all the way along rivers. And so the rivers are the only place for organisms to come down to drink. So they are a water supply for the broader landscape. And so they're, where there is connectivity, where there's ability for organisms, animals to move from up the hill down into the river, they will still do so. So macropods, there's no emus left around here, I don't think, but all the birds will still come down to the river to drink. Rivers are also important as a sign of ecological health. They are a fantastic barometer for everything that's happening upstream. Now, if you look at the river here, what we can see is that the banks are pretty much degraded. There's virtually no native vegetation left. They're geomorphologically unstable. You can see erosion, slumping. You can see the river is full of sediment. This is not a healthy river. And that is indicative of everything that's happened upstream. Now, pre-European river in this section, as I said, probably would have been higher in the valley. The reason the beds have lowered generally in rivers is because there's more water flowing down. Water's not being kept in the upper landscape, so it flows into the river quicker and then flows downstream quicker, and that's eroding the beds, and you get this thing called bed lowering. And it's not catastrophic here yet, but in a lot of rivers, especially further up catchments, the bed lowering can be so catastrophic. There are now lots of money being spent to actually build up the riverbeds again, putting in large woody debris, trees in the river, putting posts in to slow down the water flow so sediments start building up again. But because the river is lower in the landscape, what that has done to your river banks, it's made them steeper. So if you imagine if a river was here and the top of the bank was there, 200 years ago the river might have been at that angle. Now with the bed lower, the banks are steeper. Now, every type of bank has what they call angle of repose. Different soil types, you can actually pile up in a different angle and they'll stay there. If you pile them up too steep, they slump. And you're lucky, sand has actually quite a steep angle of repose because it's big and chunky and heavy. But silts, basically, if you have a steep silty bank, they just will slump in rivers. So, but you can see here, obviously because of slumping, the angle of repose is actually too high, which means in a ideal system, the top of the riverbank would probably be another 10 or 20 metres that way to give you the angle that would be sustainable. Rivers are also important in the general ecosystem as a moderator of fire. So again, different in these sort of landscapes, but in pre-European landscapes, fires would often burn two rivers and not cross them. Especially since a lot of natural fires in pre-Indigenous burning times, and then even with Indigenous burnings, a lot of the fires they used were low intensity and rivers form barriers. And that's important because a lot of, if you have too much of the landscape burnt, you can actually reduce its viability for a whole lot of organisms. And so having one patch burnt down to the river and then having unburnt area on the other side is important for a whole lot of faunal species. For a couple of reasons. One, it means they've still got food and habitat, but also Australian ecosystems tend to rely on a mosaic of what we call successional stages. So if you look at time after a fire, straight after a fire, you've got nothing on the ground, and then the trees start reshooting, and then you get things like acacias and the peas coming up, and then the grasses, and then gradually you get the shrubs, and 40 years later you get the rainforest coming in. Having that patchiness of variety of periods after fire means you've got much more diversity of plants and animals able to survive in the landscape, moving between the different patches to get different things. So, grass eaters would come in straight after a fire, so the macropods. While 30 years later, when the grasses all died because it's shaded out, you might have possums in there because they're eating the rainforest fruit. So fires were really important to moderate fire. Sorry, rivers are important to moderate fire in the landscape. They're also critical for seed transport. The same way that rivers move nutrients and sediments downstream, they also move seeds. And so if you do have occasional destruction, whether it be big floods ripping out banks, so you've just got bare soil, or you've got fires burning down to the riverbed, seed will come downstream. And one thing that's interesting here is that I think seed is moving downstream, but it's pretty much all casuarina at the moment. And part of that is very likely that upstream that so much of the riparian vegetation has been cleared, there's just not the variety of seeds to come down. Rivers are also critical for vertical and horizontal connectivity. Corridors are something everyone talks about. Very few people actually understand what a corridor is, even government. Back when I worked for Department of Land and Water Conservation, their idea of a riverine corridor was 4 rows of casuarinas. And that, yes, it might hold the bank together a bit, but it has no ecological functionality. Corridors, by their nature, should allow things to move. So corridors can be useful for birds. Corridors can be useful for things like koalas. Corridors can be useful for things like plant genetics and plants to move through the landscape. But each corridor function, each of those functions needs a different type of corridor. And so having monocultures of plants will not allow movement of many species through them because different species need different plants to move through. A corridor for a koala needs either habitat trees, refuge trees, or food trees every 10 to 20 meters. While something for a large bird, you might be able to have a corridor that has patches of trees every 2 or 3 kilometers. Small birds they can't travel more than, say, 50 or 100 meters between patches. So the connectivity is going to be very dependent on what you want to move through the landscape. Plant genes, so the idea of genetics being able to move through the landscape, often you need wide corridors so that you get the pollinators in, so the pollen from that tree gets moved to that tree, then the next generation it moves from that tree to that tree. And so a lot of the corridors are too narrow to actually allow genetic movement of plant material down and up catchments. The river corridors are also often critical for connectivity back into the landscape. I mentioned about animals coming down to feed and to drink at rivers. So you need often, if you want a functional landscape as a whole, you really need to look at how the rivers connect to these hilltops over here with a bit of bush, or wetlands a couple of hills back. Things can't magically just move. You need to actually have some avenue, metaphorical and literal, for organisms to be able to move between patches of habitat. And that's one of the biggest issues we have right across Australia, is that you might actually have viable areas of habitat scattered through the landscape, but species can't move between them. And if they suddenly go extinct, if you get a fire there and you lose your lizards, they're not going to be able to get back in because they just can't travel from the next population. So part of long-term planning for any group, and again, I'll go to more detail later on if you want, is looking about what endpoint you want, what goals you have for landscape functionality. So what organisms do you want to have in the area? So if you want koalas, you're going to have to plan at a landscape scale. If you want small birds, you've got to plan at a landscape scale. While if you're just more interested in the geomorphology, that you want stable banks, that's an entirely different question. So different aims will mean you have to do different things. Question was a statement, first of all, saying this corridor is nowhere near as wide as it needs to be. How wide should a corridor be? Again, it's what you want to get out of it. For geomorphological stability, in an area like this, you'd probably want to go another 10 metres back into the paddock. And the reason for that is that planting on top of a bank, and I'm doing all this out of order now, but planting on top of a bank like just here on the slope, it's putting a lot of downward pressure on there. And so when the banks are saturated during a flood, the weight of the trees can actually cause the banks to collapse. While if you had vegetation back up here as well, the roots will be holding the whole thing back up. So for that reason alone, geomorphology, you'd want to go back about another 10 metres. Also, for geomorphological stability, you want complex root systems as deep as possible. Casuarinas tend to have surface roots, so they'll stop little floods just flowing across the surface. They'll stop the surface eroding away, but if it's a heavy flood, they'll just fall over. Because yeah, the statement was that in big floods losing. Yeah. So getting complexity is also critical. If you wanted to look at functionality, so say if you wanted a koala corridor, 50 metres is probably ideal from the river's edge to back up there, and getting in, making sure that there's koala food trees. I mean, koalas will sit in casuarinas, but they can't eat them generally. They will nibble on them occasionally to get salt, but you'd want Tereticornis or amplifolia or grey gums through here as well. If you're wanting bird corridors, you'd probably want to make sure you got enough berry-producing plants in, so the birds can actually move through the landscape. The question was, does the other side of the river need to get involved as well? And the answer is yes. Ideally, you do both sides of the river and you do the entire landscape. And my answer is Landcare should be a cancer. It should just grow and metastasize and set up new cells over there and infect the people next door. I can say that because I've had cancer. I had a brain tumor, so I can make cancer jokes. The statement was about the river being an administrative boundary, and that does create problems. But there's so many examples of Landcare overcoming that. Landcare has abilities that government doesn't. Councils often find it difficult to collaborate. Government agencies often find it difficult to collaborate, but there's nothing stopping you from having a stall at Greta about the river and encouraging a Landcare group to start across the river. Showing them, having a field day and inviting people from that side of the river to come and see what you're doing, inspiring them, enthusing them. Okay, the question was how wide should small bird corridors be? The width is not so critical for small birds because they will often flit through sort of even a few rows of trees, but they won't travel large distances between trees. So you need contiguous connection for small birds. The opportunity for small birds, though, is don't make corridors, make habitat. So corridors are great for things to move through, but they've got to go somewhere. If you just got corridors all through the landscape, things are going to get exhausted trying to find somewhere to live. Creating patches that are big enough for things to live in, and then move to the next patch that's big enough to live in. That's the challenge in landscapes, especially in these smaller block agricultural areas. Because if you've got 1,000-acre farms, yeah, you can put aside 100 acres for a habitat patch. If you've got a 100-acre farm, it's a lot more of a challenge to do that. But that's where collective effort comes in, because if you're willing to put aside 10 acres and you're willing to put aside 10 acres and you're willing to put aside 10 acres and you patch it all together on your boundaries, suddenly you've got 30 or 40 acres. No one's lost too much land on their own property, and there's a big enough bit of habitat for things to live in and breed and have a good breeding population. Most animal species are what they call outbreeding species. They produce more young than can live on site. And so what happens is either they die, the young, if there's excess population, they die off, or they move somewhere else. And so giving them the ability to breed in a site and then move somewhere else is a challenge, but one I think it's worthy to take. And things like small birds, it's easier than it would be for, say, koalas or macropods or possums or gliders, where there's more challenging habitat requirements. Yeah, one thing that change in the landscape has done, it's favoured some native animals significantly. And so often there's a lot more wallabies and kangaroos in a landscape than there would have been pre-European, because when it was all forest, there was only grass in patches when there's been fires. So the kangaroos and wallabies would have moved through the landscape following the fires. Now there's grass everywhere, so and there's water everywhere. Everyone's got farm dams, and so some populations of some species have increased remarkably. As an aside, there's an interesting concept that's happening around the world, which is this thing called behavioural bottlenecks. So in cities, we lost virtually all wildlife. Most native species disappeared, but the few that remained were actually quite adapted. They're the ones that had the best adaptations to living in cities, and they've now bred up big populations. And so when I was a kid in Sydney, the only birds we saw were pigeons, Indian miners, and LBBs, little brown birds. Now there's dozens of native bird species that are taking over Sydney. We've got brush turkeys in the middle of the city. We've got bandicoots right through the city now, ibis right through the city. So all these species have become adapted to city life and are now breeding up big populations. And the same's happened in agricultural landscapes, that we've created conditions that favour some species and disfavour others. But at the moment, the disfavouring hasn't resulted so much in so many of these bottlenecks. But it's probably going to happen. In the US, they've found that things like coyotes, populations are increasing, and bears, because the few that remained in the highly altered landscapes have become adapted to those landscapes and are taking advantage. In Europe, you've got bears, wolves. In Scandinavia now, wolverines are popping up everywhere. And it's because the population was almost extinct. The ones that survived were able to live in the changed landscape, and bang, they're now everywhere. So we'll probably, if we can actually keep all our animal species alive long enough, they probably will get adapted to some degree to the changed landscapes. But doing things like Landcare helps them, because we're actually giving them the sort of habitat they do need.